I'm not sure if my career is so much distinguished as schizophrenic, but thank you anyway. We've heard a good deal this morning about the problems with the industrial relations system in Australia and the consequences of the system. And at the end of the last session, we started to touch on what possible solutions might be, which brings us nicely into what I'm here to talk about. Adam asked me, as a member of the board, to put forward the H.R. Nicholls Society's agenda for change in this area, what we think we need to do in order to get jobs growth booming again in Australia. I should stress that as a non-IR specialist, I don't claim to be the person who has come up with all the answers or who's the expert on all of the detail. And I draw with gratitude on a paper that was written last year by Teresa and Des, setting out the areas in which we think that reform is most urgent, the need for reform is most urgent. The foundation of the Society's call for reform is a belief that there is no substantive imbalance of bargaining power in a labour market which consists of 800,000 employing businesses in Australia and a workforce of 12 million. The dynamic and the dispersed nature of our employment market makes it virtually impossible for employers to impose unfair conditions on employees on a sustained basis. So it follows that the costs of a complex and highly regulated system such as ours are unmatched by any benefits to workers. Now, the H.R. Nicholls Society has to strike a balance between purism and pragmatism. We want to lead the debate, but not to lead it in a way which consigns our recommendations to irrelevance. So in that spirit, we would advance this agenda, and my one intellectual contribution to the wonderful work that Teresa and Des has done is, as a political advisor, I've turned it into a 10-point plan because we all know how important those are in politics. So I'd like to cover the agenda under 10 different headings, the first of which is fixing the enterprise agreement system. We think that enterprise agreements should be restricted to matters that pertain to the employment relationship. That is to say, they should not include matters which are basically provisions to benefit unions, such as deduction of union fees, paid union training leave, leave to attend union meetings, or restrictions on the engagement of independent contractors or labour hire workers. Bargaining for agreements should be optional. If employers prefer to fall back on the minimum standards of modern awards and national employment standards, well, that is what those are there for, and there should be no basis to force them into bargaining through protected industrial action. The requirement to make a greenfields agreement with a union should be abolished, and there should be no delay in introducing an agreement that complies with industry standards. This change would address Australia's rampant labour cost growth, which is focused in particular sectors such as resources that are critical to our economy, where unions are effectively empowered to blackmail companies attempting to establish new major projects. Finally, the Fair Work Commission should not be allowed to publish enterprise agreement applications on its website. This is a practice that allows unions to make vexatious and frivolous objections to agreements to which they are not party.
Hear, hear.
The second area that I'd like to address is reforming awards. Employment conditions that can be included in modern awards are extremely burdensome. Under the Workplace Relations Act 1996, there are only 13 allowable matters which could be included, focused on matters like remuneration, hours and leave. Even those 13 matters are excessive, but they'd certainly provide a better foundation than today's arrangements. Few policy objectives are more critical to the country than helping young people secure their first jobs and getting them on the employment ladder for as a foundation for a life of productive employment. I've heard employers lament the dearth of experienced employees, and we have a host of government inquiries and programs to address the alleged shortage of suitably skilled and trained employees, addressing what people in that area like to portray as some sort of market failure. But there can be no restocking of that pool of experienced and skilled employees unless the incentive exists for employers to take on young people and give them that experience. Junior rates under modern awards need to be urgently reviewed to make employment of juniors attractive. And more broadly, the minimum wage needs to be addressed, and we've heard from the Commission of Audit in recent days on this topic. and the need for a more rational setting of the minimum wage, and one which has regard to the differences across geographical regions in Australia. The third area which I'll turn to is the reintroduction of individual contracts, and reintroducing individual contracts that are consistent with the national employment standards and subject to a better off overall test would restore some flexibility to the system. Voluntary agreements between employers and individual employees are at present curtailed by collective bargaining and restrictions in regard to the individual flexibility agreements, and this leaves both parties worse off when we have a situation where they're unable to consummate an agreement which they both believe to be to their benefit. The fourth area that I'll turn to is eliminating conflicts of interest in respect of superannuation. The role of trade unions in managing industry super funds, into which a significant proportion of employee salaries are diverted, often by default, establishes a truly glaring and malignant conflict of interest. In recent days, we've seen revelations of an industry fund passing on the confidential details of its members to union officials for the purpose of disrupting the business of an employer who had fallen from favour. Occurrences like this are not random incidents. They reflect the systemic flaw of allowing unions to negotiate the compulsory diversion of an element of workers' remuneration to lucrative funds management businesses that are under their control. The Productivity Commission review of 2012 urged the establishment of a new independent body to assess the funds to be listed in modern awards. Ultimately, though, I think the policy objective needs to be to create a genuinely competitive superannuation industry, one in which the role of default funds is greatly diminished. The fifth area is constraining rights of entry. The Society believes, at a minimum, that right of entry provisions should be wound back to those that applied under the Workplace Relations Act 1996, restricting unions' rights to enter an employer's premises to circumstances where they're a party to an instrument on site. If you'll allow me a personal remark on this topic, in my days working for Peter Costello, I remember puzzling over a summary of the right of entry changes that were going to be put forward as part of work choices. I'm a non-IR specialist, and at times I think, while I don't have deep expertise in the area, it does bring the benefit of a fresh pair of eyes. And coming from outside, the very concept of right of entry is truly puzzling to me. Laws that empower unions to fulfil, effectively in some cases, the role of regulators, for instance, in relation to health and safety, create such an obvious potential for abuse. And the concept that a union has a right of entry to a workplace, frankly, I find puzzling. The sixth area I want to turn to is discouraging wrongful industrial action. Now, the Coalition's policy is to ensure protected industrial action can only happen where there have been genuine and meaningful talks between workers and businesses, and that the claims made by both parties are sensible and realistic. If I can put on my non-IR specialist hat again, it seems very strange to someone who practiced as a lawyer in other areas of the law that we've basically established a statutory scheme to allow suppliers of labour to walk away from their contractual obligations as a form of negotiating leverage without enabling purchasers to walk away from their obligations in response. It's a sort of complex statutory protection for breach of contract by one party to a commercial arrangement, and it seems a perverse element to introduce into the governance of a particular class of commercial arrangements. We believe that protected industrial action should be abolished. The seventh area is abolishing unnecessary statutory rights and causes of action. There are a number of statutory protections that are unnecessary and that are unduly oppressive on employers, leading to lower employment. General protection claims and adverse actions have become a de facto unfair dismissal system for senior managers. These claims are now measured in the thousands, and we believe they should be abolished. Workforce bullying provisions provide a jurisdiction for dubious and often highly subjective claims to be made without any attempt at mediation or informal resolution. They create another avenue, unnecessary avenue, for disgruntled employees to apply leverage against employers. And the right to request flexible working arrangements puts the onus on employers to justify the way that they choose to run their business, and it's unnecessary in a competitive labour market. The eighth area relates to making unions obey the law. Now, as we all know, monetary penalties have been insufficient to deter some unions from flagrant disregard for the law, such as the Grocon dispute that was discussed earlier, where the CFMEU was found guilty of 30 contempt of court charges. Unions that engage in consistent behaviour of this sort should be deregistered. In addition, the poor governance standards of unions have been highlighted by recent scandals, such as that relating to the HSU and Craig Thompson. And it's clear from the evidence given to the Hayden World Commission so far that a culture of corruption has been allowed to fester in the trade union movement for many years. Union governance and reporting requirements should be aligned with those that apply to companies under the Corporations Act. The ninth area is addressing critical sectors of the economy. The Australian Building and Construction Commission should be re-established, as foreshadowed in draft legislation before the Parliament. Further, the special provisions that apply to the building industry, i.e. the Fair Work Building Industry Act 2012 and the Building Code 2013, should be extended into the resource sector, reflecting that sector's importance to the Australian economy and the growing evidence of unreasonable union demands and conduct that threatens resource sector investment. And finally, the 10th point is transfer of business arrangements. The current legislation subjects transfers of businesses to heavy restrictions, including on the insourcing and outsourcing of work. Australia cannot be internationally competitive if our businesses are constrained from adjusting their business strategies and operating models. At a minimum, the less extreme restrictions of the Workplace Relations Act 1996 should be restored. So, the reforms that we've proposed across these 10 areas are modest, they're sensible, and they're balanced. They would remove some of the most oppressive constraints on business, boosting employment in Australia and enhancing our competitiveness, but they would leave in place the foundational protections for workers. These reforms are not the end of the journey, but they would be a significant step towards an industrial relations system that serves Australia's national interest. Inevitably, vested interest will attack this agenda as pro-business or anti-worker. In truth, it is neither. The Society's agenda is pro-employment. The current industrial relations systems in many ways reflects an unhealthy consensus built between powerful vested interests. While it swings between the interests of established big businesses and established labour organisations, the true victims of the system are neither of these. The true victims don't have an industry association to represent their interests. They don't have a union to advocate their cause. They are the unemployed of Australia, both those who appear in our national statistics and also those who do not, for the reasons that Des outlined, because they have ceased to look for work, and we can see that in our declining participation rate. It's their interests that are too often forgotten in discussion around industrial relations policy, and it's their interest that the H.R. Nicholls Society's agenda exists to advance. Thank you.
Well, Alan, thanks very much. That's a very useful summary. Now, if you were advising the Treasurer or the Prime Minister, how quickly or how much of that do you think should get out into the public arena as part of the policy of a political party? I've got in mind what you were saying at the end, you know, a lot of resistance to any of that stuff that you put out. So there's a lot of need to get the general public who may be interested in it but don't understand all the various parts of it.
Yeah, look, I think it's a very difficult political communication challenge, and we found that out last time round with work choices, obviously. I think there are elements of this that can be sold to the public, and I think often a society like this tends to exist in a bit of a IR academic sort of milieu in which people discuss you know, the philosophy behind it. To the vast majority of the public, the way that you have to sell things like this is through the proverbial vox pop, through individual examples. I mean, I find it very difficult, for instance, to believe that the average Australian would regard as reasonable someone on $250,000 going on strike to try and blackmail the project, you know, to use one example. I find it pretty hard to believe that they think that an employee who kicked an employer in the head should be restored to their position. And I think that before you can launch into massive and wide-ranging reforms, you need to illustrate the need for them. I think probably the other example I should put there is what is in fact being done with the Hayden Royal Commission. That is to say, the way that unions are governed needs to be exposed, the corruption needs to be exposed, and I think also that should extend into the handling of industry superannuation. So I think that by moving into these areas where there are manifest injustices that can be made clear to people on an individual basis, you can start to build the political impetus for reform. And to use an example, I mean, you know, these things don't necessarily all have to happen at once. Protected industrial action, you know, abolishing it for people on salaries over $150,000 might be a lot more palatable than just, you know, abolishing it outright. So I think that there are ways that you can move forward. I hate to use the word incrementally because I know that Kyle's going to call me soft afterwards. But
might not wait. Already have.
Thanks.
I think that if I just add, what's very relevant here is the budget. I mean, in my view, without going into any detail at all, they failed to sell the idea of reducing spending and reducing the deficit to the general community.
Well, that's because they're not doing it.
Well, if they'd actually sent a paper out or published a paper, this is why we need to do it, they might have even convinced themselves.
Dare I say it that I've seen more outrageous government advertising campaigns in my time than one which might, for instance, highlight Australia's fiscal trajectory and educate people.
Yeah.
John Osborne?
Yeah, thanks, Alan. You mentioned that the reforms outlined were modest and reasonable. Now, that's certainly not the way that the ACTU would respond. How do you think we can better capture the middle ground with our ideas that are not white shoe brigade radical, but are really just common sense and about giving people opportunity?
I think we could get Kyle to outline his ideas, and then, you know, we'll be in the middle of the road. I think on a serious note, I think it comes back to the sort of thing that I said, that until we start to get individual examples out there in the public mind, because people don't understand it when it's you know, written as an academic paper. People understand it when they see that guy on $250,000 going on strike and blackmailing a project and putting other jobs at risk. And I think the great folly in politics is always to propose a solution before you've enunciated the problem. In fact, work choices was the classic example of that. People went, where the hell did this come from? I don't know what problem this is trying to solve. So until we can, you know, really communicate to in the public mind the problem, it's useless to try and sell them the solution.
Stuart?
Alan, thanks for the sensible 10 points. If we apply the Corporations Act to union reporting, will that give us the tools to flush out what the actual salaries are being paid to union leaders in Australia? Because you kind of get the whiff that they're getting somewhere between $200,000 and $600,000 each when you add up all their various benefits and the boards that they're on. But that's all very cleverly hidden at the moment.
Yeah, look,
comment on that?
I think that would be a wonderful thing if we had that sort of transparency, and it might well be a little bit more difficult for some of those union leaders to sell themselves as the friend of the common man if people knew the
Nothing's too good for the worker.
The Taxpayers Alliance in the United Kingdom were able to compile such a list, and it makes fascinating reading. They were able to get it through some FOI legislation, but unfortunately that particular legislation doesn't exist in Australia. Greg?
Yeah, I was just going to comment as a follow-on to your question.
So could you speak slightly louder?
Sorry, I was just going to follow on to the question that you asked and then to your 10 points, which I think is excellent. I would only say that typically in an education process like that, you're going to have more success the fewer things you try to tackle. So to the extent as a society that you can decide on the one thing and do that really well, the others can snowball from there. When you're out in that kind of education, whether it's employees or whether it's, you know, unemployed or government or whatever, you don't want to dilute yourself, so you can have goals, but if you prioritize, and you might have more success if you say this is the one thing that is the easiest to understand, and if you can make progress with that, then the rest might be easy.
And in fact, I think that one thing, although I know some people here would shoot me down for saying it, but probably the one thing that one might move on before anything else is the corporate governance standards surrounding unions, because the problem is now so bloody obvious to everyone in this country.
Right.
Their right to move.
Last question, Graham.
I suppose very interesting. Go back at 10 things. 2 points. One, the access to sites. When we got rid of the unions of the high-rise sites and the Sunshine Coast, one of the things we did was actually let them on, because they really didn't want to be let on at all. They wanted to show that they were fighting for the workers and pushed out. So sometimes some of these things, they sound good, but they probably aren't that important. There seem to be, in all of these issues, you talked about, let's control the unions. But at the end of the day, if you've got disclosure about how much money union officials are getting, I mean, what else do we need to know about the HSU if you're a member proposing to join? God sakes, we know everything. The problem is where do they go? Where does the worker go that's just discovered that their union official's getting $500,000 when there's no alternative? You don't seem to mention that at all in your list.
No, and I think the idea of competition in that area is actually quite an exciting one. I agree. I don't have a solution to that. Does anyone else?
Why is it on your list then?
Why don't we toss it to private equity?
Well, it seems like a good business model, so I'm sure I'll be
There you go.